Never met a cliche we didn't love. Neil Oliver joins us in the studio, archaeologist, historian and host of Coast Australia. Well, host of Coast, really, is where we first came to see him. I was just chatting to Neil outside about the part of Scotland that my family come from, that I've seen him detail on the coast of UK. Neil, welcome to the studio.
Thanks very much for having me.
Well, thank you for your program, because we got given an advance copy yesterday. We went home to our respective homes to watch the preview of Coast Australia. They only gave us the episode that deals with the Kimberleys and the northwest of our country, but it is absolutely fascinating, and thank you for educating us about our history. I had no idea that those rapids existed, that you went down...
The Horizontal Falls.
Horizontal Falls.
Honestly, if you were only to see one episode... Kimberley, I have to say, honestly, is possibly the best episode of Coast that I've been involved with. You know, taking in everything. And simply stunning. And, for example, you mentioned the Horizontal Falls, which is this natural phenomenon where you've got an ocean basically draining with the tide through a very small gap.
Yeah.
And because the volume of water is too great to get through the gap all at once, it's like a flooded house emptying through the letterbox. The water builds up. And so at times you end up with a sort of 10-foot difference between one side of the gap and the other. And you can ride through it on powerful ribs and boats. And at the same time as this sort of exciting adventure's going on, you're passing rocks folded like melted toffee, you know, ancient rock, which is something of the order of 3.5 billion years old. So it's a landscape that just makes you feel insignificant.
Well, you have the advantage over both of us, because you also deal with Broome and with Roebuck Bay. Did you have any idea that those planes were strafed by the Japanese in Roebuck Bay during the Second World War?
Absolutely none at all.
And they're still there.
Yeah,
I know, and
the wrecks are still there. Yeah,
that's the other thing I've always felt is affecting about the Coast project, that it moves between, you know, just inviting people to celebrate the grandeur of a landscape, and then it suddenly swings down into sometimes human tragedy, sometimes human triumph. But it goes from the big, the macro, down to the micro, and it's a very satisfying mix, I've always felt.
Well, the thing that I was amazed about was, no, not amazed about, but the fact that you'd never been to Australia before, and your obvious surprise and enthusiasm about something like the Kimberley that you had no idea existed.
It's funny, when you grow up in the UK, there's always programmes about Australia. You know, Britain is fascinated with Australia, I presume, because so many British people have family connections here. Yeah. So you do grow up watching a lot about Australia and feeling that you know the place or that you've seen it, but nonetheless there was nothing prepared me really for the reality of being physically in Australia. And I think I've said it to other people along the way that I realised that because of the heat here and the sunshine, I had expected the place to look kind of faded, as though the colours would have been kind of bleached. Yeah. But it was completely the opposite. I was stunned by the vibrancy of the look of the place, you know, the colours, especially in the Kimberley, for example, the reds, the golds, and then contrasted with the blue of the sky and the water. It was so fresh, and in fact, rather than fading the place, it was as if the sun was continually stripping the place raw, so that you were seeing it for the first time. You
did come to this neck of the woods, and you went from the Mornington Peninsula, I point over there, down to Port Campbell along the Great Ocean Road. We haven't seen that episode, but did you enjoy yourself?
I enjoyed all of it. The Great Ocean Road, I had a helicopter ride along by the 12 Apostles, you know, the sea stacks that I'm sure are so familiar to Australians. You must all have seen them endlessly. And we told the story of the creation of the Great Ocean Road as well, which was built after the war. It was just, I had not appreciated what a variety of landscapes and climates I was going to encounter. So on the one hand, I would be in, say, the Great Ocean Road, and then we jumped across Bass Strait to Tasmania, and I really enjoyed the climate in Tasmania because, frankly, it kind of reminded me of home. Yeah, it was quite cool, and also the landscape itself reminded me of Scotland, particularly the part of southwest Scotland where I grew up. So I felt particularly at home, strangely, in Tasmania. But then to go from there to Darwin and the top end, and you're suddenly in that furnace. We were there before the monsoon broke, as it were. We were there while the heat was still at its most intense, and I found that my time in Australia just overwhelming. It was as if there was a fourth dimension here. It was just, there was something else that I hadn't encountered.
Tell me, do all coasts erode? I remember seeing a special on television once about them having to, I think, probably Dover, somewhere like that, having to relocate the lighthouse to drag it back because the coast was eroding. Is that true of all coasts or only some?
Well, I suppose what you're in, the coast is one of the most dynamic environments that we have, simply because it's where the land meets the sea. And what you've got, the sea gives and it takes. So where it's eroding, the material that it erodes out is obviously being deposited somewhere else. So as one coastline recedes and is cut away, the sea will dump that material somewhere else. So some other part of the mainland will be growing at the same time. But yes, there are, particularly in the east coast of England, there are many places where, people who maybe 20 years ago bought a house and had 100 metres of ground between them and the cliff, now their house is in the water. Because it's come back over the course of a single generation.
Did you see any of that in Australia, where some residences might end up in the ocean?
We haven't specifically followed that story in Australia, but it absolutely will be the case. That's why the coast, in part, is such an exciting place, because it's changing all the time. You tend to, if you're familiar with watching your weather forecasts, everyone thinks they know the shape of their country, and it feels as though it's permanent. But it's anything but. With every wave that breaks, the shape of your country changes momentarily, and then the next wave breaks and it changes again. And it's just in a constant state of flux. That's why the coast is such a compelling place to be.
If people are contemplating coming to Australia, the one place above all I would think that I would recommend them to go to would be the Great Barrier Reef.
Well, I certainly had. We stayed on. Obviously.
Did you go by helicopter again?
No. To get to there, we went by a little plane from Cairns.
Yeah.
And we flew up to Lizard Island. And my fellow presenters visited other parts of the Great Barrier Reef. I myself was on Lizard Island, and I had the opportunity to go snorkelling, which I have to say I was fairly terrified about, because I'm not used to water where there's big things with teeth. I know you're all very cool about it, but frankly, I spent a lot of my time looking over my shoulder while I was in the water, thinking what's coming here. But unbelievable. And here's the one that really sticks in my memory. We were snorkelling and filming on Lizard Island on the Great Barrier Reef. We finished late morning on the day and we got in a little plane, flew to Cairns down to Sydney, got in another plane, flew to Broome, drove 4.5 hours north of Broome, got in a helicopter and flew for an hour and a half to Freshwater Cove in the Kimberley. And I was able to get out of that helicopter and say to the people who were meeting us, do you know what I was doing yesterday lunchtime? I was snorkelling on the Great Barrier Reef, and here I am in the Kimberley. And that moment in some ways encapsulates the kind of out-of-body experience that I was having in this whistle-stop tour of Australia.
We've got a studio full of Scots at the moment. We're all of Scots heritage. And I think there's a debate going on about Scotland possibly seceding from the Union. I don't want to lend you into controversial circumstances.
Well,
do you have a view?
Well, yeah, 2014, I think the date's been set now. I think it's a date in September. There'll be a referendum on whether or not to remain part of the Union. I'm always wary, because I always think people like me, that because I'm a familiar face, I get the opportunity to pontificate about things, and I don't really want to. My opinion doesn't count for any more than anybody else's. However, that said, I am happy with the way things are. Britain's been a united kingdom for 300 years, and I think that has served both or all of the nations pretty well. I wouldn't want to see the breakup. In my head, it feels like contemplating a divorce.
Right.
And I always think, you've got to be careful about divorces, because, I think most...
Could lead you to get married again.
Well, quite. Well,
or you lose half your castle.
But having said that, it's clearly something that the whole nation, has to make it its own. Every individual within the nation has to make up their mind.
Neil, been lovely to make your acquaintance. Let's get the message out there. Coast Australia, which we were both knocked out by yesterday, premieres on the History Channel, Monday, December the 2nd, that's next Monday, at 7:30. Coast Australia on the History Channel. Lovely to make your acquaintance.
Oh, thank you very much for having me. It's a pleasure.